On a narrow barrier island in Palm Beach, Florida, there rises a house that should have died at least twice. Mar-a-Lago, sea to lake. Even the name sounds like a promise of permanence, a world suspended between two bodies of water and somehow above ordinary time. The estate stretches across 17 acres from the Atlantic surf to the still waters of Lake Worth Lagoon. It contains 126 rooms, 36,000 antique tiles, towers, courtyards, loggias, gardens, and the kind of theatrical scale that only immense money can make appear inevitable. When it was new, it required a staff of 60 simply to keep the illusion alive. The woman behind it was Marjorie Merriweather Post, heiress, collector, hostess, and one of the richest women in America. In the 1920s, when Palm Beach was hardening into a seasonal kingdom for industrial fortunes and inherited power, Post decided that an ordinary mansion would not do. She wanted something closer to a private palace, a residence grand enough to impress diplomats, enchant royalty, and place her unmistakably among the architects of American glamour. She filled the rooms with imported stone, rare objects, old-world craftsmanship, and the confidence of someone who believed money could command endurance. For a time, it seemed she was right. Behind its gates passed presidents, aristocrats, financiers, and celebrities, all moving through interiors designed to flatter wealth and dramatize status. Mar-a-Lago was not merely a home. It was a performance of power. It embodied the conviction, common among the very rich, that beauty on a sufficient scale could overpower history, economics, even mortality. But houses like this do not survive on beauty alone. After Post died, the estate began the long, humiliating descent that so often shadows great American fortunes. Ownership shifted. Purpose shifted. The fantasy thinned. The federal government accepted the property, then recoiled from the expense of maintaining it. Prospective buyers admired it from a distance and fled when the numbers became real. The house was too large, too costly, too impractical for the age that inherited it. By the mid-1980s, demolition was no longer an idle threat but an approved outcome. Crews stood ready. The machinery of erasure was in place. One more Gilded Age dream was expected to collapse into dust. It did not. This is the story of a mansion that escaped extinction, but not because it was loved purely for its beauty. Its survival, like its creation, was entangled with ambition, timing, vanity, and the strange durability of American myth-making. And that story begins well before Marjorie Post, before architects drew their first elegant lines, before imported stone crossed the Atlantic. To understand Mar-a-Lago, you have to understand the land that made such a place imaginable. You have to go back to a coast without grandeur, to a strip of unsettled sand, and to an accident at sea that altered the destiny of an island not yet fully named. Before the fortunes, before the lawns and lanterns, there was wreckage, salt water, drift, and a first beginning. On January 9th, 1878, chance arrived off the Florida coast, disguised as disaster. A Spanish brig called the Providencia, sailing from Havana toward Barcelona, struck the shallows and came apart in the surf. Her crew escaped. Her cargo did not. 20,000 coconuts, packed in the hold, broke free and rolled into the Atlantic, then drifted ashore along a barrier island that was still more wilderness than destination. The place was known, somewhat grandly, as Lake Worth country. A few settlers occupied it in scattered wooden houses, weathered and provisional, as if they too might be washed away in the next storm. They saw the wreck from shore and hurried toward it, not out of romance, but necessity. The sailors had already taken to safety. What remained was salvage, and salvage meant value. Families gathered the coconuts by the wagon load. Some were opened for food, most were planted. It was a practical act, yet it altered the identity of the island. Coconut palms were not native to Florida, but they accepted the sandy soil and marine air with surprising ease. Over the next decade, the shoreline changed. What had been scrub, saw palmetto, and tangled brush took on an exotic silhouette. The coast began to look less like frontier and more like an idea of the tropics, curated first by accident, then by ambition. The island's first permanent settlers had arrived only a few years earlier, in 1872, and their lives were harsh in ways later visitors would find hard to imagine. Heat pressed down for months at a time. Mosquitoes rose in clouds. Storms moved in with little warning. Supplies came by water when weather allowed, which was not often enough. Men and women hacked clearings out of dense growth with hand tools, built crude shelters, planted citrus and pineapples, and fished the lagoon and ocean to bridge whatever the land refused to provide. Survival was possible. Comfort was not. By the standards of the late 19th century, the place was remote, even for Florida. Yet the altered shoreline attracted attention. Northern visitors soon took note of the palms. The island needed a name that sounded less raw, less provisional, more marketable. Palm Beach answered that need with suspicious perfection. It suggested warmth, elegance, and escape before any of those qualities truly existed there. Names like that do cultural work. They prepare the imagination for the money that will follow. In 1880, the Coconut Grove House opened as the island's first hotel. It offered winter visitors access to sun, sea air, and a landscape that still felt undiscovered. By 1890, the community remained small, only a few hundred people. There was a church, a post office, and the fragile routines of settlement. There was also Sticks, a black neighborhood that housed many of the laborers whose work made the enclave function while leaving them largely outside its mythology. Even in its earliest form, Palm Beach depended on invisible labor and hierarchy. That pattern would survive every architectural style and every generation of wealth. For all its charm, the island was still isolated, difficult, half-formed. Then, Henry Morrison Flagler arrived, and difficulty became opportunity. He stepped onto the island in 1893, rich beyond ordinary comprehension, from his partnership with John D. Rockefeller in Standard Oil. He had recently opened the Ponce de Leon Hotel in St. Augustine and understood something many industrialists were just beginning to grasp. Leisure, properly packaged, could be as profitable as industry. Florida did not need to become civilized in the old sense, it needed to be staged. Flagler walked the island. He studied the strip of land between ocean and lagoon, the coral base beneath the sand, the western light over the water. Where others saw inconvenience, he saw composition. The site possessed the ingredients of a winter fantasy for America's rising upper class. It only lacked infrastructure, transportation, and the capital required to erase reality and replace it with elegance. He began buying land at once. Construction started that same year on the Royal Poinciana Hotel, an undertaking so outsized it seemed almost delusional. Materials arrived by barge. Workers arrived by the hundreds. The hotel would contain more than 1,000 rooms and rank among the largest wooden buildings in the world. Set on the lakefront, it was conceived as a declaration that this isolated edge of Florida had entered the map of American privilege. But glamour requires machinery, and machinery requires people. The hotel needed cooks, laundresses, gardeners, carpenters, porters, clerks, and servants in great numbers. Palm Beach could not house them, feed them, or absorb the demands of such an enterprise. Flagler's solution was as revealing as the hotel itself. Across the water, on the mainland, he created West Palm Beach as a support city for the fantasy he was building offshore. Workers would live there. Shops and services would operate there. The labor necessary to sustain elite leisure would remain close enough to function, distant enough to disappear from view. It was efficient and deeply American in its moral geometry. Beauty in one place, burden in another. The Royal Poinciana opened in February 1894. A month later, Flagler's Florida East Coast Railway reached the area, collapsing distance for wealthy northerners who could now arrive in railcars and enter the island's refined landscape without confronting much of the rough country that surrounded it. Soon, the guests came in force. In 1896, Flagler opened the Palm Beach Inn on the oceanside, later known as the Breakers, giving visitors direct access to the Atlantic and deepening the island's allure. Seasons formed, habits hardened. The wealthy did what the wealthy often do once a place begins to flatter them. They claimed it. They did not remain hotel guests for long. They built winter houses, then larger winter houses, then estates intended to rival the social capitals of Newport and Manhattan. In 1902, Flagler completed Whitehall, his own vast residence, a Gilded Age proclamation in marble. With that house, Palm Beach ceased to be a curiosity and became a court. By the time the town incorporated in 1911, its residents had already begun codifying exclusion into the landscape. Clubs refined membership, zoning protected values, social rules hardened into architecture and custom. A subtropical aristocracy took shape, draped in bougainvillea and restraint. By the early 1920s, Palm Beach had become the winter theater of American wealth. Addison Meisner's Mediterranean fantasies rose along the island. Worth Avenue drew luxury commerce. The old wilderness had not merely been improved, it had been overwritten. In its place stood a managed paradise whose elegance depended on money, service, exclusion, and performance. Every lawn, facade, and dinner invitation expressed ambition. And yet, even then, Palm Beach had not seen its defining palace. The island had been prepared for it by wreck, by speculation, by railroads, by labor, by architecture, and by the American appetite for grandeur, softened by sunlight. What remained was the arrival of a woman wealthy enough to build beyond reason, theatrical enough to think on a dynastic scale, and confident enough to believe a residence could become immortal. She was coming, and with her would come the house that fixed Palm Beach forever in the national imagination itself. On May 9th, 1914, Fortune arrived wearing mourning. Marjorie Merriweather Post, 27 years old, learned that her father, Charles William Post, had died by suicide at his estate in California after years of physical decline and pain he no longer believed would lift. He was 59. She was still young enough in another life to have been sheltered by grief. Instead, grief was delivered alongside command. In a single brutal turn, she inherited not only a vast personal fortune, roughly $20 million in cash and assets, an almost indecent sum for the era, but authority over one of the fastest-growing food companies in the United States. The empire had begun in Battle Creek, Michigan, in conditions that now sound mythic in their modesty. Her father had built it from a barn, beginning with postum, a roasted grain beverage marketed as a moral corrective to coffee. The claims were extravagant, sometimes suspect, but they worked. Grape nuts followed, then Post Toasties. By the time Charles Post died, the company was no longer a clever experiment in health culture. It was a national business, embedded in the American pantry. Marjorie inherited scale, momentum, and scrutiny. She was better prepared than many men would have been. Charles Post had not raised his daughter merely to be ornamental. He had brought her into the business early, exposing her to meetings, numbers, factories, strategy. She understood production, branding, and leverage. She understood that sentiment was a luxury and timing a weapon. Yet preparation did not erase the reality of the world she was entering. In 1914, an heiress might control wealth, but she did so in a culture still structured to doubt female command. Marjorie could run a corporation before she could cast a ballot. Her first marriage offered little reinforcement. Edward Bennett Close, a lawyer from a respectable background, had married her in 1905. They had 2 daughters and the outward shape of security, but not the same appetite for ambition. Close favoured the soft rituals of society over the harsher disciplines of expansion. He was comfortable where Marjorie was restless. He inhabited privilege. She intended to direct it. Their marriage eroded under that difference, and Marjorie began to understand that if she meant to preserve and enlarge what had been placed in her hands, she would need not merely companionship but an accomplice in scale. She found one in Edward Francis Hutton. E. F. Hutton possessed the financial temperament that suits empires in moments of acceleration, disciplined when required, aggressive by instinct, and alert to possibilities others dismissed as premature or absurd. When Marjorie divorced Close and married Hutton in 1920, she did not step away from power into domesticity. She consolidated. The pairing was socially glamorous, but its deeper significance was structural. She had capital, control, and vision. He had market instinct, appetite, and nerve. Together they converted inheritance into expansion. The company entered a new phase. It went public in 1922, with Marjorie retaining dominant ownership and Hutton installed in a leadership role that gave outward form to what remained, at its core, her enterprise. Acquisitions followed with the precision of a campaign. Jell-O enlarged the company's hold on the American dessert table. Walter Baker chocolate widened its reach. Maxwell House coffee brought a national ritual into the portfolio. With each purchase, the business moved farther from its origins and closer to becoming a modern consumer empire. The most consequential decision emerged not from a boardroom, but from a meal. While traveling by yacht off the Massachusetts coast, Marjorie and Hutton were served a dish prepared from food that had been frozen for months and yet retained an improbable freshness. At the time, frozen food was associated with compromise. Dulled texture, ruined flavor, the deadened aftertaste of convenience without refinement. But Clarence Birdseye had developed a quick freezing method that changed the chemistry of preservation. Marjorie recognized the implication at once. Hutton hesitated. The obstacles were obvious. Grocers would need new equipment. Consumers would need persuading. Distribution systems would have to be built almost from scratch. Marjorie looked past the friction to the transformation beneath it. She understood not only the technology but the domestic labor it might replace. Anything that could give time back to the household was not a novelty. It was a revolution waiting for packaging. In 1929, they acquired Birdseye's company for $22 million. The old name, Postum Cereal, had become too small for what the enterprise now was. It was renamed General Foods, a title broad enough to house national appetite. By then, Marjorie Merriweather Post had become one of the most formidable businesswomen in America. She moved through the country as both heiress and builder, rich by inheritance, but unwilling to remain passive inside it. Yet wealth on that scale creates its own emotional hunger. Marjorie collected art not as decoration, but as atmosphere. She staged dinners and philanthropic gatherings in her 54-room apartment in New York, with the polish of someone who understood that social life, at the top, was another form of architecture. Influence had to be hosted before it could be exercised. Still, winter called her south. Florida offered distance from the hard edges of the northern season, but her first property there proved insufficient to her imagination. It was not large enough to sustain the entertaining she envisioned or the scale of presence she wished to establish. Palm Beach, by then, was the logical stage. The island had matured into the seasonal capital of American privilege, with infrastructure, ceremony, and audience already in place. In 1923, Marjorie began searching in earnest for a site. The island was limited. Much of the most desirable oceanfront had already been claimed by earlier fortunes. She needed not merely prestige, but geography, breadth, structural stability, and visual drama. What she found was 17 acres reaching from the Atlantic to Lake Worth Lagoon, a rare sweep of land anchored on coral rock strong enough to support serious construction in hurricane country. Water on both sides, exposure and shelter in a single composition. to build what she imagined ordinary competence would not do. Marion Sims Wyeth, who had designed her earlier Palm Beach house, understood her preferences and the Mediterranean vocabulary she favored. But Marjorie wanted more than a beautiful residence. She wanted atmosphere, procession, revelation. She wanted a house that unfolded like theatre and lingered like memory. For that, she turned to Joseph Urban, the Viennese-born designer whose work for the Metropolitan Opera and the Ziegfeld stage had made him a master of spectacle. Urban understood how scale could be made intimate, how ornament could direct emotion, how rooms could behave like scenes. Wyeth would provide structure and discipline. Urban would shape mood, texture, and wonder. Together they would produce something Palm Beach had not yet seen. A residence drawing on Spanish, Venetian, and Portuguese influences, yet unconcerned with pure historic fidelity. The aim was not imitation. It was grandeur calibrated to personality. The woman who had helped transform a cereal business into General Foods was now preparing a different kind of enterprise, one made of stone, tile, labor, performance, and permanence. Within months, construction would begin on a private palace unlike anything America had built for itself. In the spring of 1923, Marjorie Merriweather Post stood on 17 raw acres of scrub and sand in Palm Beach and described a house that did not yet exist, except in appetite. The site looked exposed and unfinished, low vegetation, salt air, hard light, and the stillness of land awaiting elegance. She was not imagining a winter house, nor even a grand one. She was imagining a private world of such scale and finish that it would alter the island around it. Beside her stood the two men she had chosen to make that vision real. One would solve the practical problem of how to build it, the other would solve the more dangerous problem of how to make it unforgettable. Marion Sims Wyeth, the architect, understood structure, proportion, and discipline. Joseph Urban, the designer, understood theatre. He knew how architecture could seduce, how a room could be staged to overwhelm without seeming vulgar, how light, surface, and ornament could create an atmosphere that felt ancient and newly invented. Post needed both sensibilities. She wanted permanence, but she also wanted enchantment. A house of this order had to do more than function. It had to exert power. Wyeth moved first, putting ambition into geometry. The plan took shape as a great crescent embracing a central court, its main block rising 2 stories, with lower wings extending outward to contain guest rooms, staff areas, and the hidden machinery of elite living. At the center, a tower would rise more than 70 feet, visible from a distance and positioned to command the island in every direction. Urban turned from plan to surface. He imagined stucco walls, deep loggias, red tile roofs, arcades, carved ornament, and rooms drawing from Spanish, Venetian, and Portuguese precedents without submitting entirely to any of them. The result would feel Mediterranean in lineage, but American in scale and self-confidence. The collaboration worked because each man remained fluent in his own language. Wyeth considered hurricane resistance, circulation, the connection between wings, and the practical logic beneath spectacle. Urban took those bones and taught them to perform. He selected materials, designed decorative schemes, and treated the house less as a container than as a sequence of revelations. Guests would not simply enter Mar-a-Lago. They would be guided through height, shadow, color, and display into admiration that bordered on submission. Construction began in the fall of 1923, and the site changed with startling speed. A temporary village of labor and machinery appeared almost overnight. Post had authorized whatever manpower the job demanded, and men came in large numbers, many crossing each morning from West Palm Beach to work in punishing heat. The ground itself had to be subdued before elegance could rise from it. Palm Beach sat atop coral rock, a stable but difficult base, solid enough to support great weight and stubborn enough to resist excavation. Crews blasted the hardest sections with dynamite, broke up the fractured stone, hauled away debris, and poured concrete into forms that would bind the first floor to the coral beneath. What later visitors would experience as serenity began with force, noise, sweat, and rupture. Post had made one principle unmistakably clear. She wanted the best materials that money could compel into motion, no matter how far they had to travel or how difficult they were to install. Urban took her literally. From Genoa came shiploads of Doria stone, a fossil-marked limestone valued not only for beauty, but for temperament. It weathered quickly, acquiring the patina of age, and that quality appealed deeply to Post. She was building a new house, but she wanted it to carry the authority of something already old. When the stone arrived in Florida, masons began cutting and carving it on site, shaping arches, columns, moldings, and decorative details according to designs that grew more elaborate as the work progressed. If the exterior promised distinction, the interior was meant to approach astonishment. Post acquired an immense cache of antique tiles, around 36,000 pieces in all, assembled over years by a prominent sugar family and then dispersed into her possession. Many were centuries old. No two were exactly alike. Some bore geometric patterns, some floral motifs, some narrative scenes. Installing them required patience bordering on obsession. Craftsmen had to arrange mismatched historic ceramics into coherent surfaces, balancing variation with rhythm and improvising where dimensions resisted order. Other materials arrived by equally improbable routes. Black and white marble was salvaged from an old Cuban residence. Venetian silk was selected for walls that needed softness rather than stone. Heavy carved beams in a Spanish manner were set across ceilings to give gravity and shadow to brighter spaces. Metalwork, plaster, glass, and wood all passed through expert hands. Post's instructions did not favor restraint. She wanted texture, distinction, and evidence of craft wherever the eye came to rest. At the project's peak, hundreds of workers moved across the grounds in a daily choreography of exhaustion. Carpenters, stone cutters, plasterers, painters, tile setters, gardeners, laborers, and teamsters worked through brutal summers, sudden storms, shipping delays. Post paid close attention to the operation. Meals were served on site. She did not intend for the labor sustaining her vision to be interrupted by hunger. Across Palm Beach, the estate became a spectacle before it was a residence. Residents watched the walls rise, the tower emerge, and the red tile roof spread across the curving plan like a declaration. The scale was impossible to ignore. Even Whitehall, Henry Flagler's marble monument to an earlier generation of ambition, began to seem restrained by comparison. Season after season, the house clarified itself. The crescent embraced its courtyard. The tower established the skyline. The imported stone started to soften under salt and sun, acquiring exactly the illusion of age Post had wanted. Inside, Urban's sense of drama touched nearly every surface. The main living room expanded to a size unusual even by Palm Beach standards, with ceilings climbing more than 40 feet overhead. Gold leaf caught on moldings and ornament, throwing off light in ways that made the room seem animated by something richer than electricity. A ballroom was designed to hold hundreds for dinner, music, and dancing, because Post was not constructing a retreat from society, but an instrument for commanding it. Each major room was given its own atmosphere, its own emotional register, its own mixture of severity and seduction. Construction dragged on through the usual adversaries of South Florida building: humidity, heat, tropical weather, delayed shipments, minor setbacks that become expensive when multiplied across thousands of decisions. Post did not retreat into abstraction while others handled the details. She visited often, reviewed progress closely, and made choices that many owners would have delegated. Fixtures mattered to her. Proportions mattered. Placement mattered. She was shaping her own dream. By late 1926, the estate entered its finishing phase. Chandeliers were lifted into place. Decorative plasterwork received its final refinement. Marble floors were polished to a reflective depth. Tile compositions began to gleam. Windows were positioned to catch light deliberately, taking the low Florida sun and turning it into one more furnishing. The costs climbed past $7 million, a sum so large for a private residence that it placed the project in a category closer to princely construction than American domestic life. Mar-a-Lago was not simply expensive. It was an argument that private wealth could imitate sovereign scale. In January 1927, 4 years after the work began, the house opened. Post and E.F. Hutton marked the moment with a dinner before the Everglades costume ball, an event perfectly suited to a residence built on spectacle and social choreography. Palm Beach had seen wealth before. It had not seen this combination of breadth, finish, and theatrical confidence. The statistics alone were enough to impress. 126 rooms, 58 bedrooms, 33 bathrooms, service wings, staff quarters, kitchens capable of feeding hundreds, storage for china, silver, linen, flowers, and all the ceremonial apparatus of elite hospitality. What set Mar-a-Lago apart was the density of intention, the hand-carved stone, the antique tiles assembled into patterns that concealed months of planning, the ceilings that rose with almost ecclesiastical ambition, the tower that offered views east to the ocean and west to the lagoon, as though the estate had been designed not merely to occupy Palm Beach, but to supervise it. Outside, gardens unfolded through palms, flowering trees, and carefully arranged paths. The property stretched from water to water, fulfilling its name with almost literal arrogance. Post had achieved what she set out to achieve, not merely a mansion, but a palace calibrated to legacy. It announced money, certainly, but also discrimination, appetite, and control. It looked permanent because permanence had been purchased into every surface. Yet permanence is always the first illusion great houses sell. For the moment, though, the illusion held. The construction years were over. The true test was about to begin. Mar-a-Lago was ready for society, at last and entirely, and society was ready to be taught how to look at it. The house began performing before it was fully finished. In March 1927, weeks before the formal opening, Marjorie Merriweather Post invited a select circle of friends to dinner ahead of the Everglades costume ball, one of the season's most elaborate rituals of display. In some wings, workmen were hanging fixtures and painters were laying down final coats, but the principal rooms were ready, and ready was enough. Post had not spent 4 years and a fortune building Mar-a-Lago in order to wait politely for perfection. A house like this existed to be inhabited at once, to be tested under candlelight and music, to reveal itself through guests. That first evening set the tone. The costumes nodded toward the Ancien Regime, powdered fantasy translated into Palm Beach silk. Post and E.F. Hutton appeared with deliberate extravagance, dressed less as host and hostess than as sovereign figures presiding over a private court. The gesture was theatrical but not frivolous. Mar-a-Lago had been conceived as a setting in which wealth would not merely be observed, but arranged and intensified. Even half completed, the house made its point. Post understood a rule that governed elite America in the interwar years with unusual clarity. Money, by itself, did not secure status. It had to be translated into form. Jewelry could dazzle, yachts could suggest reach, travel could imply cultivation. But entertaining did something those other luxuries could not. It gathered power into one room and made power visible to itself. A successful dinner could create alliances, flatter rivals, manufacture mystique, and establish a woman not merely as rich, but as central. Mar-a-Lago gave Post the architecture to do that at a scale Palm Beach had not yet seen. The season of 1927 established the rhythm that would define the estate for years. Post and Hutton arrived in January and remained through the late winter weeks when the island was crowded with industrial fortunes, titled visitors, political operators. At Mar-a-Lago, dinners followed one another with controlled regularity. Some evenings were intimate by her standards, around 30 guests. Others expanded toward 50, large enough to feel significant and still intimate enough to preserve hierarchy. The menus were exacting, prepared by kitchen staff drawn from top New York establishments, and adapted to Palm Beach's blend of tropical ease and northern expectation. The guest lists were among Post's greatest achievements. She sat at the crossroads of business, politics, philanthropy, and high society, and she understood how to use that position. A European noblewoman wintering in Florida might be seated across from a composer, a museum patron, a financier, or a diplomat. Post believed dinner was most alive when worlds touched that did not ordinarily meet. She was not interested in mere sameness. She preferred friction softened by etiquette, novelty contained within protocol. At her table, conversation itself became social engineering. That quality distinguished Mar-a-Lago almost immediately. To receive an invitation was not only to be admitted to a beautiful house, it was to enter a carefully edited social experiment. No one arrived certain of who else might appear. Palm Beach, for all its rituals, could be provincial in its exclusivity. Post widened the frame. She drew in artists she admired, musicians she patronized, diplomats she considered useful, and charitable figures whose presence gave moral sheen to luxury. She wanted movement, surprise, encounter. It was never only about dinners. The larger entertainments mattered just as much. Charity balls, musicales, benefit evenings, and formal gatherings tied to causes she favored drew crowds that would have overwhelmed lesser houses. At Mar-a-Lago, the ballroom absorbed them. There was room for spectacle, room for processions of gowns and white tie, room for the signals through which society measured itself. In 1929, she arranged for the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus to perform on the property for a charitable event. The idea had a faintly surreal brilliance. The grand house of a serial heiress becoming, for an evening, a site where Palm Beach wealth and popular spectacle shared the same lawn. She invited children from West Palm Beach to attend alongside donors and guests, a juxtaposition that was intentional rather than sentimental. Post's philanthropy was rarely abstract. She liked visible, organized gestures that proved money could be directed outward without losing any of its social force. Even her benevolence had form. She understood that generosity, when staged correctly, could deepen rather than diminish prestige. Yet there was something sincere in her insistence that wealth had obligations. The house itself made such layered use possible. Its crescent plan allowed one mode of living to unfold while another was prepared elsewhere. A formal dinner could be underway in one section, while musicians rehearsed in another. Guests, staying overnight, occupied suites, removed enough from the main traffic of entertaining to preserve privacy without sacrificing proximity. Service corridors, staff spaces, kitchens, storage rooms, and receiving areas worked behind the scenes to maintain the illusion that abundance had no mechanics. The beauty of great houses often depends on what they conceal. Post ran the estate with a degree of administrative rigor that mirrored her business life. She was not simply a gifted hostess moving by instinct through flowers and candle arrangements. She noted who had attended, what had been served, which combinations of guests had succeeded, and where the room had gone flat. Seating charts were not trivial to her. Menus were not afterthoughts. She refined events the way an executive refines a product line, by observation, adjustment, repetition. Hospitality at her level was neither casual nor entirely spontaneous. It was strategy in evening dress. To support it required a formidable labor force. During the height of the season, the staff included cooks, servers, chauffeurs, housekeepers, laundresses, groundskeepers, valets, and those whose titles history rarely preserves. Some lived on the estate in service quarters built into the larger design. Others came daily from West Palm Beach, crossing the social distance that made Palm Beach function as both paradise and machine. The house looked effortless because other lives supplied the effort. Post, by the standards of her class and era, was regarded as a fair employer. Meals were provided. She believed service improved when workers were treated with respect. Still, the elegance of Mar-a-Lago rested on labor that remained mostly invisible once the guests arrived. The interiors reflected another dimension of Post's authority, her eye as a collector. Over time, she filled the rooms with art, antiques, and objects acquired across Europe and beyond, not as static trophies, but as living accompaniments to the house. 18th century French furniture stood in rooms intended for use, not reverence. Venetian glass caught the Florida light. Fine china appeared on tables where people actually dined from it. Later, Russian imperial pieces associated with her years abroad entered the collection, carrying into Palm Beach an undertone of vanished dynasties and displaced grandeur. Yet Post resisted turning the estate into a mausoleum of taste. She wanted beauty handled, sat upon, and spoken around. And yet, as often happens in houses built for triumph, strain began to gather behind the glitter. The partnership between Post and Hutton had always been as much strategic as romantic, and strategies do not necessarily age into tenderness. By the early 1930s, those close to them could sense the erosion. Public polish remained, but private compatibility had thinned. The marriage ended in divorce in 1935. The following year, she married Joseph E. Davies, a Washington lawyer whose path led away from Palm Beach and into diplomacy. When Davies was appointed ambassador to the Soviet Union, Post went with him to Moscow. Mar-a-Lago fell quiet. For 5 seasons, the house that had been designed for fullness, music, and movement stood largely closed. Caretakers remained. Maintenance continued where it could. But a house of this magnitude does not like absence. Rooms built for conversation become unnervingly still when no one uses them. Silk and wood, tile and plaster, all the costly surfaces of cultivated life begin to feel slightly haunted when left without witnesses. Post returned only intermittently through the late 1930s and into the war years. The estate demanded too much staff and attention to be maintained at full rhythm while her life was elsewhere. In 1944, she gave the property a different purpose. The grounds were opened for wounded veterans of the Second World War who needed occupational therapy and restorative time away from military institutions. Men recovering from physical and psychological damage walked the same gardens that had once framed costume balls and orchestral evenings. The contrast was startling and perhaps clarifying. A house built during the fever of the 1920s could still serve, in wartime, as a place of repair. For Post, this was not a contradiction. It was proof that wealth, if properly directed, need not be imprisoned inside ornament. She returned to Mar-a-Lago as a full winter residence in 1948. By then, she was older, more deliberate, and the world around her had changed. The pre-war social order had been bruised by depression, conflict, and a new American seriousness. Yet Palm Beach still responded to ceremony, and Mar-a-Lago still possessed something few houses ever achieve: inevitability. It felt by then less like a novelty than an institution. Post resumed entertaining, somewhat more selectively, though without surrendering the principle that the house should remain animated by guests. The Red Cross Ball became one of its most enduring expressions. Beginning in the late 1950s, Post hosted the event annually, and it quickly settled into the calendar as one of Palm Beach's defining evenings. White tie, decorations, gowns, jewels, ritualized philanthropy. All the old ingredients remained, but now distilled into a cause whose prestige matched the setting. The event outlived her, which is one measure of how thoroughly she fused private residence with public ceremony. Even her lighter enthusiasms found architectural form. In 1961, she added a pavilion specifically for square dancing, a deliberate embrace of something less formal, more American, and almost mischievous, in contrast to the house's old-world gravity. Palm Beach society, dressed for elegance, learned country steps beneath a roof paid for by industrial fortune. Post enjoyed the informality. By then, Mar-a-Lago had proven itself in the way Post most wanted. It was not merely a beautiful object, nor simply an advertisement for wealth. It was an instrument through which she organized a life social, philanthropic, aesthetic, and managerial all at once. The rooms had done what she built them to do. They had absorbed royalty, politicians, artists, businessmen, donors, wounded soldiers, and old friends. They had held music, gossip, strategy, flirtation, ceremony, fatigue, and reinvention. For nearly half a century, Marjorie Merriweather Post refused to let the house become inert. She kept it full of sound, movement, and consequence. Great houses often die long before they are demolished. Under her, Mar-a-Lago did not. It lived. Mar-a-Lago may have defined Marjorie Merriweather Post's winters, but it did not contain the full reach of her life. Palm Beach was only one theatre in which she learned to arrange power, and in the mid-1930s that talent carried her into a setting far more dangerous than any ballroom. In December 1935, she married Joseph E. Davies, a celebrated Washington attorney with a formidable network inside the federal government. Davies had moved for years in the upper corridors of Democratic power and knew Franklin Roosevelt well. When the administration needed a trusted figure for a delicate diplomatic assignment, his name surfaced naturally. In August 1936, Roosevelt called him while he was in the Adirondacks and asked whether he would consider an ambassadorship. Davies replied that if he were to go abroad, he would prefer one of the great unsettled capitals of Europe, either Berlin or Moscow. Berlin was unavailable. Moscow remained open. He accepted. By November, he had taken the oath, and soon afterward, he and Marjorie sailed east. They arrived in the Soviet Union in the early months of 1937 and took up residence at Spaso House, the official American embassy residence, where they would live for the next year and a half. What had begun as a social education among millionaires now became something sterner, elegance deployed as discipline in the presence of power. Nothing in Palm Beach society had prepared Marjorie Post for Stalinist Moscow. The city was grand, severe, ceremonial, and fearful all at once. The regime advertised itself as the future while governing through suspicion, deprivation, and force. Public life was choreographed. Private life was compromised. Show trials unfolded with theatrical cruelty, recasting old Bolsheviks as enemies of the state. Bureaucracy and terror moved side by side. Foreign diplomats occupied an uneasy space, tolerated and monitored in equal measure. At Spaso House, it became clear quickly that privacy was largely an illusion. Household staff reported to Soviet authorities. Rooms were assumed to be overheard. Conversations carried risk, even when spoken indoors and softly. Yet the old rules of influence still applied. Diplomacy, at its most human level, depended on ritual, and ritual often began at the table. Marjorie understood that instinctively. She transformed Spaso House into a setting for American hospitality under conditions that made hospitality feel almost defiant. Formal dinners brought together Soviet officials, diplomats, military figures, and foreign guests who might otherwise have met only through memoranda and suspicion. Marjorie supervised the details with the exactitude she had once applied to Mar-a-Lago: flowers, seating, tableware, pacing, menus, atmosphere. She paired French and Russian porcelain with orchids in carefully chosen shades and ensured that the meals displayed American abundance without vulgarity. Even the ingredients carried meaning. In a country defined by shortages, a well-run dinner could function as a subtle argument. The work was not trivial. The United States had recognized the Soviet government only a few years earlier, and the relationship remained fragile, improvised, and mistrustful. Every evening that ended in courtesy rather than coldness mattered. Every conversation made easier by lighting, placement, or tone contributed to a climate in which official relations could endure strain. Marjorie never wrote policy, but she understood environment. An environment can shape what policy becomes possible. In the tense, watchful rooms of Spaso House, she practiced a form of soft power that was no less real for being domestic in appearance. Moscow gave her something else as well: a new field for her collector's eye. The Soviet state, hungry for foreign currency to finance industrial ambitions, had begun selling treasures seized after the revolution from imperial residences, noble families, and Orthodox churches. Objects that had once affirmed dynasty and devotion were now treated as assets to be liquidated. Icons, liturgical vessels, imperial porcelain, gilded furniture, jeweled objects, and Fabergé pieces passed into the market under circumstances both practical and tragic. To Soviet officials, these works belonged to a discredited order. To Post, they represented refinement, craftsmanship, and continuity, too valuable to be casually dispersed. She began buying with deliberation. Her acquisitions were not random trophies gathered for novelty. They formed a rescue operation disguised as collecting. She purchased ecclesiastical pieces that had survived centuries of worship, imperial eggs made for the Romanov court, portraits, textiles, and furnishings whose original settings had been broken apart by revolution. She had the resources, the access, and the instinct to recognize that entire chapters of material culture were being dismantled in real time. What the Soviet state was willing to sell in the name of progress, she was willing to preserve in the name of memory. The collection deepened after Moscow through dealers, auctions, and private channels. In time, it became the finest assembly of Russian imperial decorative arts outside Russia itself. Davies was transferred to Belgium in 1938. Within a year, Europe was moving into catastrophe. His account of the Soviet period, Mission to Moscow, became widely known and later reached Hollywood, where Post herself appeared as a screen character, an unusual fate for an American society figure. The marriage endured for years, but eventually ended, as several of hers did, in separation. The art remained. That art would later find its permanent home at Hillwood, her Washington estate, where visitors can still see the objects she drew out of a collapsing world. The Fabergé eggs, the porcelain, the icons, the furniture. Each carries two histories at once: the splendor of the empire that made it, and the violence of the system that dispersed it. Post did not think of herself as a diplomat in the formal sense. She was doing what she had always done, arranging rooms, gathering people, recognizing beauty before others had fully priced it. Yet in Moscow, under the shadow of surveillance and fear, those gifts took on unusual seriousness. She proved that the social intelligence once exercised in Palm Beach drawing rooms could operate in a harsher theater. She could host amid danger, collect amid collapse, and impose grace where almost nothing else felt secure. By the late 1960s, Marjorie Merriweather Post had begun to think about the afterlife of her possessions. She was in her 80s, her health had begun to fail, and the question was no longer whether she would leave behind houses and collections, but who would inherit the burden of maintaining them. Great estates are often described as legacies. In practice, they are also systems of expense. Roofs fail, gardens spread, staff must be paid, air and salt wear down stone, and beauty, once built, begins immediately to charge interest. Some decisions came easily. Hillwood, her Washington estate with its decorative arts collection, would become a museum. Camp Topridge in the Adirondacks could pass into public stewardship in New York. But Mar-a-Lago posed a harder problem because it had always existed between residence and monument. It was too large, too specialized, and too expensive to be comfortably inherited. The annual cost of maintaining the property had climbed beyond $1 million. Post's daughters had their own lives and no appetite for assuming command of a private palace in Palm Beach. She understood the alternatives. Across the country, other great houses of the 1920s had already been demolished or subdivided by the arithmetic of modern life. The land beneath them often proved more useful than the architecture above it. 17 acres stretching from ocean to lagoon were worth a fortune even without a mansion on top. Developers would have lined up to imagine a cleaner future. Post considered demolition, if only because she knew sentiment does not balance a ledger. But the thought of leveling Mar-a-Lago carried a particular violence. It would not merely remove a structure, it would erase a chapter of herself. So she searched for an heir grand enough to justify the scale. The federal government, she reasoned, already maintained ceremonial properties for presidential use. Why should the nation not possess a winter residence in Florida, a place where a president could receive foreign leaders beneath a subtropical sky in rooms that advertised American abundance? Mar-a-Lago, in her mind, could become a diplomatic stage. It had the size, the weather, the architecture, the theatrical confidence. The transfer was arranged with care. Upon her death, the estate would pass to the federal government through the National Park Service. A trust would provide $100,000 a year to help offset maintenance, an amount that sounded respectable on paper and inadequate to anyone who understood what the house actually consumed. Congress approved the gift in 1972. President Richard Nixon signed the acceptance legislation. Post secured what mattered most to her: official recognition that Mar-a-Lago was not simply a private indulgence, but an asset of national dignity. She died on September 12, 1973, at the age of 86, and the estate passed as planned into government hands. The trouble began almost immediately. Nixon had accepted the house, but he did not need it. He visited Mar-a-Lago only once, for an inspection, and never used it as a functioning presidential residence. Then Watergate consumed the last act of his administration, and the estate became little more than an awkward inheritance at the edge of Palm Beach. Gerald Ford, his successor, had no special interest in South Florida pageantry either. The house remained empty, expensive, and politically irrelevant. Jimmy Carter's administration evaluated the property more seriously, but seriousness did not improve the numbers. Staff reviewed the house, the setting, the maintenance requirements, and the security vulnerabilities. The trust fund covered only a fraction of actual operating costs. Taxpayers would be expected to absorb the rest year after year for a property with no established presidential use. The location also posed practical problems that glamour could not solve. Aircraft noise from Palm Beach International Airport intruded on the fantasy of isolation. To protect a president there at modern standards would require infrastructure that did not exist and would be costly to create. The romance of a winter White House began to collapse under the weight of operations and budgeting. By the end of 1980, Congress moved to return the property to the Post Foundation. No president had slept there. No summit had defined it. No state ritual had justified its upkeep. Mar-a-Lago, which Post had imagined as a national house, came back diminished, not in appearance, but in status. It had been offered to the Republic and declined by practicality. The old problems returned at once. The maintenance burden had not eased. The trust income was still inadequate. The daughters remained uninterested in taking over the estate. The foundation placed the property on the market at a figure that reflected its location, acreage, and glamour. Yet glamour proved easier to admire than to buy. Deals emerged, then dissolved. Inspections raised uncomfortable questions. Anyone who looked closely could see that owning Mar-a-Lago meant inheriting not only prestige, but a private economy of endless obligation. Neglect followed with quiet cruelty. Without a full staff and constant supervision, deterioration moved in quickly. Exterior paint began to fail under the salt air. Gardens, once disciplined into elegance, thickened into overgrowth. Rooms that had once held diplomats, royalty, orchestras, and charitable spectacles sat in near silence. Caretakers kept watch. Realtors escorted the occasional interested party through the fading splendor. Most left impressed and unconvinced. By 1985, the Post Foundation reached the conclusion so many owners of great American houses eventually reach. The land had become more valuable than the dream. Plans were drawn to demolish the mansion and divide the property into smaller parcels for development. It was a coldly modern solution, entirely rational and culturally brutal. If executed, it would wipe away the imported stone, the antique tiles, the painted ceilings, the service wings, the gardens, and the layered memory of half a century. Mar-a-Lago would join the list of gilded estates erased not by war or fire, but by maintenance budgets, inheritance fatigue, and the logic of real estate. Demolition crews were expected. Then a developer from New York entered the story and changed its fate forever. Donald Trump noticed Mar-a-Lago in 1982, during the years when his name was becoming inseparable from spectacle, leverage, and self-invention. The estate was impossible to miss. 17 acres spanning the width of Palm Beach, from the Atlantic to Lake Worth, crowned by a mansion that seemed less built than staged, as if some Mediterranean court had washed ashore in Florida and calcified into stone. The Post Foundation had put it on the market for $20 million. On paper, the number was enormous. In context, it was almost irrationally low. Nothing else on the coast offered that combination of acreage, location, pedigree, and presence. Trump was 39, and his image was hardening into that of a developer who preferred scale to subtlety. New York was his natural terrain, a city whose real estate wars rewarded nerve, timing, and the appetite to turn negotiation into theater. Palm Beach was different, but he recognized value when it appeared in distress, and Mar-a-Lago was clearly distressed. The house had history, glamour, and land no zoning regime would ever permit again. It also had deferred maintenance, carrying costs, and a seller running out of options. His opening offer came in below the asking price, around $15 million, and the foundation rejected it. At that stage, they could still imagine a cleaner buyer, someone willing to pay for grandeur without argument. For a while, that did not seem impossible. Prospective purchasers appeared. A few moved far enough into negotiation to suggest rescue. But one by one, the deals collapsed. Financing failed. Inspections exposed the cost of reviving a house that had sat too long without the staff and money required to preserve its dignity. The broader market softened. By 1983 and 1984, Mar-a-Lago remained unsold, too famous to ignore and too cumbersome to love. Trump watched. That may have been his clearest advantage. He did not need the house to survive in order to make money elsewhere. He could afford patience, and patience in real estate can look much like predation. When years passed without a sale, he altered the negotiation by shifting the battlefield. Instead of raising his bid, he bought a narrow parcel of beachfront property between Mar-a-Lago and the ocean, land that belonged to Jack Massey, the entrepreneur associated with the expansion of Kentucky Fried Chicken. The price was about $2 million. The implication was worth far more. Trump then indicated that he might build on the newly acquired lot. If he did, the structure would interrupt one of Mar-a-Lago's most seductive illusions, its uninterrupted view toward the Atlantic. From the estate's loggia and terrace, the horizon had always seemed part of the house itself. Insert another roofline into that composition, and the estate changed character. It was no longer a palace floating between sea and lagoon. It was a historic house with a ruined outlook. The foundation understood the danger immediately. A discounted sale to Trump would be humiliating. Leaving the property unsold while its best view was threatened would be disastrous. Other buyers, already uncertain, had little reason to proceed. No one wants to inherit magnificence with a wound cut into its most marketable feature. Negotiations resumed under a new balance of power, one engineered with considerable ruthlessness. Trump also grasped what many buyers had treated as decorative excess. The contents mattered almost as much as the structure. Marjorie Post had filled the rooms with antiques, carpets, porcelain, furniture, and objects accumulated over decades of collecting. Independent estimates placed the value of those contents in the millions. By late 1985, the sale was completed. Accounts differ on the final figure, but the broad truth is uncontested. Trump acquired Mar-a-Lago for dramatically less than its listing price, and possibly for less than the value of what stood inside it. Ivana Trump moved quickly into restoration. Roofs were repaired, mechanical systems were updated, Overgrown grounds were cut back and replanted. Contractors moved through the estate with the aggression required to pull a great house back from neglect. The work cost millions beyond the purchase price, but that was the logic of the acquisition. Others had seen only maintenance, inconvenience, and the economics of old wealth. Trump saw asymmetry. He saw a property too costly for traditional heirs, too grand to replicate, and too symbolically potent to remain merely private. When the house was ready, people returned. Business associates were invited. Celebrities moved through rooms that had once entertained royalty and diplomats under Marjorie Post. After years of near silence, Mar-a-Lago filled again with light conversation and calculation. Trump had not merely bought a mansion. He had acquired a stage, a myth, and a piece of Palm Beach geography that modern law would never allow to be created from scratch. Where others saw a ruinous inheritance, he saw leverage disguised as architecture. By 1990, Donald Trump had entered the American drama of wealth, the moment when scale stops looking like mastery and begins to look like exposure. His casinos in Atlantic City were bleeding money. The real estate market had weakened. Lenders who had once competed to finance his ambitions had begun to study his debts with colder eyes. In the mid-1980s, his fortune had seemed to expand by force of personality alone, as if confidence itself were collateral. Now that illusion was fraying. Mar-a-Lago was part of the problem. The estate cost $3 million a year to maintain. That number did not care whether the ballroom was full or the guest rooms empty. The lawns had to be cut. The stone had to be protected from weather and salt. Roofs, plumbing, staff, kitchens, lighting, security, linens, flowers, paint, repairs, all of it continued in indifferent rhythm. Great houses do not become cheaper when neglected. They become more dangerous. Mar-a-Lago was not only a symbol, it was a machine with a relentless appetite. Trump's first instinct was to treat the land as liquidity. He approached the town with a plan to divide the property and sell off portions of the acreage for residential development, preserving the mansion while sacrificing some of the grounds that gave it grandeur. Palm Beach refused. Mar-a-Lago had landmark protections, and the neighbors had no wish to invite construction and fragmentation around them. The town's message was blunt: preserve the estate or continue paying for it. What followed was not an elegant compromise so much as a contest between private desperation and local control. For several years, negotiations moved in fits and starts. Trump needed revenue. The town wanted preservation without surrendering the island to overt commercialization. Eventually, both sides arrived at the only arrangement that allowed the house to survive without pretending it could function forever as a private residence. In 1993, the parties agreed that Mar-a-Lago could be converted into a private club. The decision altered the meaning of the estate. A mansion built for one woman's social dominion would now become a membership institution, exclusive, but no longer dependent on a single household fortune to keep the lights on. In exchange for permission to host events, serve meals, and provide limited guest accommodations, Trump would preserve the main structure and its historic setting. When the Mar-a-Lago Club opened in 1995, the model was simple and ingenious. Members would pay for proximity to beauty, for access to rooms that looked as though power had happened there. Initiation fees began at $25,000. Annual dues added another layer. In return, members received a version of aristocratic life translated into late 20th century Palm Beach. Tennis courts, a pool, spa facilities, dining rooms, social events, and the right to use a former palace as the backdrop for their own occasions. It was not merely service that was being sold. It was atmosphere, inheritance, reflected significance. The concept succeeded because Mar-a-Lago had always been designed for performance. It was built to host, to circulate, to impress, to absorb guests at multiple levels of formality. The house that had once required an heiress's fortune could now be sustained by many fortunes at once. Membership turned maintenance into income. Prestige, properly priced, became cash flow. Yet the club distinguished itself in another way, one that said as much about Palm Beach as it did about Trump. Some of the island's old institutions remained socially restrictive long after such practices had become embarrassing to discuss openly. Exclusion was often managed through delay and discretion. Jewish families understood that certain doors never fully opened. Black applicants could be diverted without anything crude appearing in writing. Gay couples were not always treated as though they belonged to the same social script as everyone else. Palm Beach knew how to preserve hierarchy while pretending merely to preserve standards. Mar-a-Lago chose a different posture. It admitted members across religious and social lines in ways that made the older clubs look increasingly archaic. Jewish families joined. Black professionals entered a social world that had often treated them as peripheral. Gay couples, too, reportedly found a level of welcome not readily available elsewhere on the island. Whether this reflected moral conviction, instinctive opportunism, or both, has remained a matter of argument. Critics saw Trump identifying a wealthy clientele that more established institutions had been too snobbish to court. Admirers argued that motive mattered less than result. Applications increased. The waiting list grew. Fees rose as demand intensified. What had threatened to become a financial sinkhole turned into a business with real earning power. The estate that had nearly dragged Trump under began helping to stabilize him instead. He kept private quarters in a sealed section of the property, while the rest of the house operated as a social kingdom, part resort, part stage set, part credential. The model also irritated the old order. Some Palm Beach residents regarded the club as a profitable insult, a place that challenged the island's unwritten codes while exploiting them for publicity. Tensions with the town continued. In 1997, Trump sued local authorities, claiming they were imposing restrictions on Mar-a-Lago that were not applied equally to clubs with more exclusionary traditions. The Anti-Defamation League publicly praised him for drawing attention to discriminatory practices embedded in the culture of elite leisure. The case was eventually settled, and over time the limitations on the club eased. By the late 1990s, Mar-a-Lago was no longer merely surviving. It was producing millions. Concerts and galas filled the calendar. Celebrities appeared. Charity events, including the Red Cross Ball long associated with Marjorie Post herself, continued under the new regime. The house had found a second life by surrendering the illusion of being only a house. Trump solved the problem that had defeated the federal government, the Post Foundation, and every cautious buyer who understood the numbers too well. He converted burden into membership, preservation into enterprise, and exclusivity into a product people were still eager to buy. When Donald Trump acquired Mar-a-Lago, he was not buying a relic. He was buying a masterpiece gone dull at the edges, a house whose scale astonished, but whose surfaces no longer kept their promises. Years of underfunded stewardship by the federal government and the Post Foundation had left their mark. The gold leaf had lost its fire. Painted walls and murals had faded into quieter versions of themselves. Salt air had worn down exterior ornament. The whole estate carried the melancholy common to great houses that have outlived the certainty of being wanted. Trump, working closely with Ivana Trump, understood that before Mar-a-Lago could be reintroduced as a stage for wealth, it first had to recover the authority of its past. This was not a project for contractors alone. The house demanded specialists who could read old workmanship without flattening it into imitation. Among them was Richard Haynes, who became the estate's artist in residence. His connection to the property bordered on dynastic. His father had served as Marjorie Merriweather Post's chief gilder during the original construction, applying the fragile gold leaf that shimmered across ceilings, moldings, and ornamental details throughout the mansion. The son had learned by watching the father. Now he returned to restore the very surfaces his family had once helped create. Using sheets of 23-carat gold so delicate they seemed implausible in the hand, Haynes renewed the mansion's gilded surfaces, one section at a time. The work demanded not only patience but memory, a feel for how much brilliance the rooms could bear, before dignity tipped into excess. Outside, he recreated the ram's head ornaments that projected from the roofline, details the Florida climate had steadily punished with sun, rain, and salt. Murals were cleaned and strengthened until their colors recovered the depth they had lost. What emerged was not a false newness but something more persuasive, the sensation that the house had remembered itself. The broader decorative campaign was coordinated by interior designer Buffy Donlin, who approached the estate less as a blank canvas than as a negotiated inheritance. The mandate was preservation with adaptation. Mar-a-Lago had to function for a different era and a different use, yet it could not afford to forget the artistic grammar that gave it stature. That balance was handled with enough care to win professional approval. In 1998, the Florida Trust for Historic Preservation honored the rehabilitation and adaptive reuse of the property, recognizing that the mansion had been returned to active life without surrendering its identity. But preservation alone was never likely to satisfy Trump. He had saved Mar-a-Lago, then monetized it, but he did not confuse survival with culmination. Once the club opened in 1995, the limitations of the original event spaces quickly became apparent. Large functions required temporary solutions that felt provisional on a property built to project grandeur. Tents had to be raised on the grounds. Air conditioning units sat outside like industrial afterthoughts. Portable restrooms appeared when crowds exceeded what the existing interiors could absorb. The arrangement was workable. It was also unbecoming. Mar-a-Lago might have been historic, but it was not meant to look improvised. Post's own ballroom, white and gold and elegant, remained impressive, yet it could not comfortably accommodate the size and frequency of events the club now wanted to host. Palm Beach charity galas, social dinners, and private celebrations demanded a larger vessel. Trump's answer was predictable and controversial. He would build a new ballroom. Because Mar-a-Lago was a designated historic landmark, the proposal triggered scrutiny. Preservationists, planners, and town officials all understood the danger. Additions to houses like this can rescue them financially while wounding them aesthetically. Every proportion, placement, and exterior detail mattered. The approved design concealed the new structure as carefully as possible within the estate, placing it low behind existing walls and shaping its exterior to harmonize with the Mediterranean vocabulary of the original house. From the road, it was not meant to dominate. Inside, however, restraint was abandoned. Trump modeled the room on Versailles, specifically on that European tradition in which architecture exists to overwhelm the visitor before a single word is spoken. The inspiration was not subtle. If Marjorie Post's Mar-a-Lago had expressed American aristocratic confidence through imported craft and cultivated eclecticism, Trump's ballroom would express something louder. Wealth translated into spectacle with courtly aggression. Construction stretched across several years, and the finished room opened in 2005. It measured roughly 20,000 square feet, nearly double the size of Post's original ballroom. The ceilings climbed to 40 feet. Crystal chandeliers hung from above in regimented glitter. Mirrors amplified the space. Gold returned in overwhelming quantity, not as a surviving accent from the 1920s, but as an atmosphere. Even the bathroom fixtures near the entrance were plated to announce opulence before guests crossed into the room. The total cost reached approximately $40 million, a figure that made clear this was not an annex but a declaration. Opinion divided exactly where one would expect. Some critics regarded the ballroom as aesthetically alien to the original estate, a Louis XIV fantasy grafted onto a Palm Beach house whose beauty had once relied on subtler forms of richness. Preservationists who had admired the earlier restoration wondered whether the new space respected Marjorie Post's sensibility or simply overwhelmed it. Others were less interested in purity than performance. The ballroom worked. It gave Mar-a-Lago the capacity to host the biggest evenings in Palm Beach, and in that sense it solved a real problem. Charity events that might once have gone elsewhere now came to the club. The International Red Cross Ball, a tradition linked to Post herself, moved into the new room. In January 2005, Trump's wedding to Melania unfolded there beneath gold, crystal, and mirrored light, offering a demonstration of what the space had been designed to do. Marjorie Post built Mar-a-Lago to impress guests with what American wealth could make permanent. Trump restored that vision, then enlarged it in his own vocabulary. The style changed. The appetite did not. Marjorie Merriweather Post believed that fortune, if it meant anything at all, imposed a duty. She did not arrive at that conviction late in life. It was present from the beginning, built into the way she understood money, privilege, and usefulness. To her, wealth without purpose was not merely vulgar. It was unfinished. The mansions, the jewels, the collections, the dinners, all of it might decorate a life, but none of it justified one. What justified wealth, in her view, was what it could be made to do once it left the drawing room. That belief showed itself early. During the First World War, while still in her 20s, Post helped fund an American military hospital in France, a serious act of wartime philanthropy rather than a symbolic gesture. Decades later, France recognized that contribution with the Legion of Honor. She accepted such honors, but they were never the central performance. Unlike many society figures whose charity functioned as another branch of self-advertisement, Post often seemed more interested in the machinery of helping than in the publicity around it. The institutions she favored were revealing. She gave consistently to the American Red Cross and did more than write checks. She volunteered, organized, and involved herself in the practical work of relief. The Red Cross did not deal in abstractions. When disaster struck, it moved. When families were displaced, it responded. Post respected organizations that translated money into immediate human use. The Salvation Army drew her for similar reasons. She was not indifferent to culture, but she understood that hunger, cold, and homelessness outranked prestige. She also gave to causes that reflected her belief in American civic life as something that had to be built, not merely admired. The Boy Scouts of America became one of her major commitments, and she funded the construction of its national headquarters in Washington. In 1971, the organization honored her with the Silver Fawn Award. Music, too, drew her loyalty. She supported the National Symphony Orchestra not simply because she loved beauty, but because she believed beauty should circulate beyond the narrow rooms of the wealthy. In 1955, she contributed $100,000 to underwrite free public concerts, helping launch what became the Music for Young America program. Children who might otherwise never have heard a symphony were brought into that world because Post thought art belonged in public life, not just private salons. Her support extended as well to the National Cultural Center that would eventually become the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. She gave before the institution possessed certainty, before the name carried myth, when it was still a proposal requiring faith and capital. That timing says something essential about her. She was willing to back unfinished things. She understood that public institutions, once properly funded, could outlive fashion and go on serving future strangers. Yet the most revealing parts of her philanthropy often remained unseen. She gave quietly to individuals, to students who needed tuition, to families under strain, to workers connected to her households and properties when hardship entered their lives. The full ledger will never be known because she did not structure her giving for historical neatness. It moved through private channels, informal rescue, unpublicized assistance. She understood something many prominent donors never do. The most meaningful charity is often the least visible. The Great Depression clarified this instinct. As unemployment widened and breadlines lengthened, Post was shaken by the scale of public suffering. She organized large fundraising events, and worked on behalf of emergency relief efforts when many of her peers retreated into insulation and decorum. She used the same skills that made her an extraordinary hostess: coordination, persuasion, social command, attention to detail, to raise money for people who had no entry into the glittering worlds she inhabited. This pattern repeated itself across decades: war, economic collapse, local hardship, institutional need. She responded with both money and management. That combination distinguished her. Plenty of rich Americans donated. Fewer treated philanthropy as labor. Post did. She seems to have believed that great wealth was not finally a form of possession, but a temporary trusteeship. You held it for a while, you administered it, and then, by what you chose to release into the world, you revealed whether you had deserved it. The public remembered the visible emblems of her life first: the estates, the costumes, the parties, the collections, the exacting glamour. Those were easier to photograph and easier to mythologize. But Post appears to have kept a different accounting. Hospitals mattered more than headlines. Scholarships mattered more than table settings. Relief mattered more than display. She spent a lifetime acquiring extraordinary things, yet the deeper shape of her legacy lies elsewhere. In the final measure, what she distributed carried more moral weight than what she possessed.